Greetings. Welcome back to Leaving Nothing Undared, a podcast from Oblate School of Theology's Department of Continuing Education. My name is Antonio Fritzi, your host, and today I'm delighted to bring to you an interview with Dr. Carlos Mendoza-Álvarez, who will be delivering our 2025 Aquinas Lecture entitled Otherness and Revelation, Aquinas in the Work of Gustavo Gutiérrez. Now, Dr. Mendoza-Álvarez is a renowned theologian. He's a professor at Boston College with expertise in systematic theology, liberation theology, and the intersection of faith and social justice. Today, we're going to learn about his journey, the themes in his lecture, and particularly how Aquinas' conception of theology as an act of love underpins Gustavo Gutierrez's understanding of the ethics of the preferential option for the poor. Thank you again for joining us, and let's get started. Dr. Mendoza, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me, Antonio.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited for you to deliver our upcoming Aquinas lecture, but before we treat the subject of the lecture, I'd really like to start at the beginning and get to know you a bit more, hear about what led you to discern theology as your chosen discipline, to become a Dominican priest, and any notable figures or insights you encountered along the way.
Well, what an interesting initial question. Well, I've been a Dominican for 44 years, I'm now one of the elders in my community. So I'm a priest of 36 years. So I've been practicing ministry, particularly following accompanying communities of different parishes in Mexico City, particularly in downtown Mexico City, but also the University Parish, where I met the students at the National University in Mexico City. And I learned with them many things, accompanying the students, but also artists, also social movements. In the last 10 years, probably I've been more closer to the social movements in my country, particularly the immigrants, but also some other groups like families of disappeared people, which is a terrible situation in my country, in Mexico. But also women, indigenous communities, and queer communities. So I've been involved in this kind of ministry for 36 years, and my theology is deeply rooted in these processes. So I became Dominican 44 years ago, and I was trained in my theological education by great scholars in Mexico, like Mauricio Beuchot, a great philosopher, trying to connect Aquinas to modern contemporary phenomenology. Also Miguel Concha, who passed away just a year ago, a great moral theologian rooted in liberation theology. He was one of our mentors, opening our hearts and minds to liberation theology in the 80s and 90s. And also Francisco Quijano, who was my mentor in fundamental theology, which is my discipline, which is a philosophical theology more related to discussions on epistemology and revelation, and how can we communicate the original event of the resurrection that we have been experiencing as Christian communities for centuries. So I was trained mainly in Mexico for the first part of my education, and then I moved to Freiburg in Switzerland. And I spent 8 years in Switzerland for my master's and then the PhD. And then I was lecturing there for 2 years. And that's also, I prepared my habilitation, which is like a postdoctoral research project. So my main figures have been Latin American scholars, but also in Europe, people like, particularly like Claude Geoffrey in France. Also, the community of the Dominicans in Paris, the editorial house of Du Cerf, which is one of the most important editorial houses in Europe. And I learned so many things with them. So I was trained also by Gutierrez in some way, and Christian Ducoq, who was the mentor of Gutierrez in Lyon in France. So my theological formation and training has been deeply rooted in the Dominican tradition.
Wow, absolutely. And, that's one of the incredible elements of your trajectory is that while deeply rooted in place and your experience in Mexico and the kind of cultural and social movements of Mexico, you also have this international experience that you pointed to, right? And of course, the Dominicans are worldwide in many ways. And I think that affords an incredible opportunity to expand the kind of scope of reference and fodder that you draw from to weave together your own theological works. Can you talk about a little more how that global experience, that kind of transnational experience, impacted and informed your approach to theology?
Yeah, actually, because of the Dominican order is like a global order, as for 8 centuries we have been involved in this kind of ministry, trying to connect with different cultures and spiritualities, different epistemologies, I would say. Epistemology is a big word, it's a philosophical term to talk about different understandings of what life is about. And so since the beginning, St. Dominic and the first Dominicans, friars, but also some nuns and lay people, lay persons, they were involved in this kind of process. They call that sancta predicatio in Latin, which is the holy preaching. Small houses, communities where the brothers and sisters and then the lay persons, they were involved preaching the gospel, searching for truth. That's one of the important ideals of the Dominican order, veritas in Latin, which is truth. Not because we own the truth, that we are looking for the truth with others. And so since the beginning, St. Dominic was sending the first brothers, Dominican friars, to Paris University to study because it's important to give room, open room to the different rationalities. Aquinas was trained in that kind of scholarship, and then his mentor was Albert the Great. So the Dominicans, we were since the beginning involved in this. And in my personal experience, I was trained in Mexico City for my undergrad studies. And then I moved to Freiburg in Switzerland, to France too. And then my ministry has been also, as a scholar, has been expanding horizons. South Africa, just a little bit. I'll be visiting this year, South Africa, for the first time. I was connected to the South African church since 5 years ago. And during COVID, I was offering some courses there. But in Brazil, particularly, I have experienced a very important moment in my theological formation. And my imagination was in some way reshaped by Brazilian context, by Brazilian theologians, because they are, for instance, trying to explore new ways of understanding the gospel related to the African traditions of spirituality. And because 52% of Brazilians, they have African roots. So that's why for them, it's so important. And in my country, in Mexico, the African roots is not so important, but the indigenous communities are there. So that's why I made those connections with the Brazilian context and then other indigenous communities in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, but Central America too. So I've been trying to connect with different possibilities of understanding what the gospel means from the different peoples and communities and cultures. And during my time in Concilium, the Journal of Theology, I was member of the editorial board and for 8 years. I also expanded my imagination, connecting with great colleagues from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. So that's why I've been working in this perspective since then.
Wow. It's incredible. And what really shines forth to me in what you've shared is how your professional journey and personal journey are really a reflection of this kind of Dominican charism of searching for truth together across cultures, across countries. And to pivot just a touch to the subject of the lecture, I note that this search goes through time as well, right? And so you bring together the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, right, who's a little farther back in time, as well as Father Gustavo Gutiérrez, who's a bit more recent. Can you share a little bit about what inspired you to explore that particular connection and why you think the insights that arrive from that dialogue are relevant to us today?
Yeah, well, my doctoral dissertation is this one, Deus Liberans, was made in Fribourg in Switzerland. And in this book, 30 years ago, I started exploring the connections between Aquinas, which is like the big reference in the Dominican tradition, to more contemporary authors like Gutierrez, but also philosophers like Levinas, the great Jewish Lithuanian philosopher. So my diachronic, my way of understanding theology was trying to connect the tradition that we have as not only as Dominicans but as Christians, rooted in the, of course, in the Bible, and then the fathers and mothers of the church in early Christianity, and then the Middle Age authors like Aquinas, to modern and contemporary issues. And I found that since then that one of the most important connections was the place of God at the center of any kind of liberation processes, because dignity, justice, and life is at the center of God's love. And that's why what's so important to connect Aquinas' understanding of priority of love coming from God as the source of being, but also of any kind of agency. And then to more contemporary authors like Gutierrez, who was also trying to connect this ineffable love coming from God to the poor, not only the poor as the unique interlocutors of God's love, but as the main reference to understand the radicality of the love coming from God as a mystery of a never-ending process of redemption. And that's why in my works 30 years ago, my doctoral dissertation, I found the intimate connection between Aquinas and Gutierrez. And through Emmanuel Levinas, a Jewish philosopher, it's interesting also that I found that the deep connection. Aquinas was referring all the time to Aristotle, but also some other Jewish and Arabic philosophers and theologians, discussing with them, searching for the truth together with them. And at that time, Aquinas was very exploring in an innovative way theology, because Aristotle was a pagan author. How can we all make some reference to a pagan author? And then in contemporary philosophy and theology, for instance, Gutierrez was discussing with Marx, talking about injustice, why injustice happens in this world. And that's why he was looking in a similar way to Aquinas, discussing with the contemporary authors in every period of time, trying to understand what was going on about justice, about love, and about forgiveness, for instance. So in my research project, I've been all the time connecting Aquinas as a big reference to understand Christianity. As in the core of Christianity is the experience of resurrection, and then how the contemporary theologians like Gutierrez, but many others, Schelebecks in 20th century, another Dominican theologian, Christian Ducoc, a great author in Christology. So I was discovering the deep connection between the two of them. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing is that this kind of discourse across these authors and influences reveals not only this kind of underlying love in Aquinas' theology, cements better our understanding of the preferential option for the poor in Gutierrez's theology, but it really illustrates part of the nature of the gospel itself, and that is that it is not merely an abstract kind of theological enterprise, but is really good news when it has good news for the poor and results in a kind of imperative toward material change and liberation in a material sense, as well as a spiritual and kind of theological sense. I wonder if you might, having touched on the importance of divine love and the preferential option for the poor, expand as well on an idea I know that you've articulated on the power of death and agency of the poor as a kind of place for their redemption to occur, or a place of redemption, and
Yeah.
particularly how that idea might challenge us in our contemporary analysis of things like violence or social injustice in our day.
Well, what probably any theologian has to really respond, the question is about evil. Why evil, and how we and God together with us can face evil. Evil in so many different ways. Of course, is um, death is like the most radical experience of evil, but also sin. Um, and we can see that today in the world at a global scale. How can we do theology if we are not responding to the questions of evil today in global society? So many expressions of evil today. And I want to connect this contemporary issues to Aquinas and the fathers of the church, and of course, the Bible and the contemporary theologians. The question of evil has been like the most challenging question for theologians since the beginning of Christianity, where God is when the innocent is suffering. How can we confess the resurrection and the mercy of God towards humanity when we listen carefully the innocent suffering? And today we have different expressions of evil, of course, at a global scale, the war in Ukraine, in Palestine, in South Sudan, the enforced immigration in the world, crossing different countries, the whole Latin American sub-region and continent trying to get to reach US territory, or the African communities trying to move towards Europe. So the question is, why suffering? The criminal mafias controlling the world. We have a new word to talk about the power of the criminal mafias. There's a very important Cameroonese philosopher, Achille Bembe. He's a political historian, philosopher and historian. He talked about necropower. It's like the interconnection at a global scale of this power coming from the criminal mafias, trafficking with all kind of goods and commodities. Of course, human life, persons, immigrants, but also guns, drugs, and so many other commodities that are in some way controlling the market and economy at a global scale. So how can we talk about God's love uh, facing evil, this particular evil? Because evil is not an abstract question or idea. It's a very personal experience and collective experience of life is threatened by powers of death. So for any theologian, the question is, how can we confess the universal love of God facing evil? And Aquinas did it, and Gutierrez did it too. One of the most important books of Gutierrez is about Job. The book of Job in the Bible is like the source for any theology trying to respond to the question of evil. And I will be talking about this in my lecture in San Antonio, celebrating this way Aquinas' legacy.
Absolutely. And while of course that kind of response covers these pressing issues that affect a number of individuals, even in our own community of San Antonio, right? It illustrates how these, again, theological concepts that we encounter in words like epistemology, like theodicy, right? The problem of evil,
Mm.
they're real and present and in many ways accessible through the experience of individuals in this community. So I really appreciate you making that connection for us. I do have a couple more questions to conclude as we arrive at the end of our time for this conversation. One of them is if you could share something that you would hope that attendees to the Aquinas Lecture really take away from the experience together discussing these kinds of topics.
You know, Antonio, when we honor the legacy of great authors like, of course, Aquinas, and that's the main author that we are mentioning here, we try to preserve their legacy. And their legacy is a way of understanding life from the perspective coming from God, trying to preserve the legacy of improving communities of love and hope. I think the most challenging virtue today in the world, in this global war we are facing in some way, because of the criminal mafias, because of the global economy, and so on, is hope. It's the most challenging virtue we need to work on in a very particular way. How can we not only it's not only about faith, and hope is the connection between faith and love. And that's why probably my takeaway in some way is, and this is an invitation also for the audience, we need to think about hope today. How can we not only think, but experience hope in the midst of this catastrophe we are experiencing? Climate change is another expression of evil, because climate change is produced by humanity, in particular by a particular economical system. So how can we support communities facing evil? And that's why my main source of for theological understanding today is how the people facing everyday evil in different ways are resisting. How are they creating ways of living together? Improving, for instance, new ways of economy at a local scale, going back to their spiritualities, rooted not only in doctrines or hierarchies, but in their own bodies, in their own ways of thinking, in their ancestry legacy. And we need to go back to this. I think theology and following Aquinas' spirit is not only Aquinas' text, because otherwise we are like going back to a kind of fundamentalist approach of Aquinas. Aquinas was a living theologian, facing at his time evil in different ways, trying to understand God's love in different ways. And that's why today Aquinas' legacy, in my understanding, connected to Gutierrez, but to contemporary theologians, could be a great opportunity for every one of us, if we are scholars, students, pastoral leaders, or communicators like you. How can we really experience hope today and learning from those communities who are facing evil in different, so creative ways through resistances? And then how can we become the body of Christ? Because going back to Aquinas again, the final process of all these redemption experience is becoming the body of Christ. And I think this is what we are in some way invited, called to be part of this process and be trying to talk about this in the lecture at the OST next January 30th, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct. And I just want to emphasize again that image you put forth of Aquinas as a kind of living theologian and our call to really live forth hope, right? I'm sure you're aware, as our audience is aware, that Pope Francis has named a Jubilee Year of Hope, right? And
Exactly.
this Aquinas lecture is an opportunity for us to come to understand what that hope would mean and living it forth, not just as a feeling in our hearts or some kind of, again, abstract theoretical concept, but as a verb, as a means of being the body of Christ, as you pointed out. On a concluding question, as a little bit more of a fun note, it's clear that St. Thomas Aquinas and Father Gustavo Gutierrez are alive in your heart, but I would ask if you could have the opportunity to take one of them to dinner and have a conversation with them, which might you choose?
Well, actually, I had the opportunity to join Gustavo Gutierrez in different moments. So And I had deep conversations. Sometimes we're a little bit like discussing important topics in different perspectives, but a great human being, a great Christian believer too. Of course, I would like to ask to invite Aquinas for lunch somewhere, and then to discuss about why he was choosing at his time those pagan authors as interlocutors, and how in our time for him would be his interlocutors in contemporary philosophy, social sciences, so on. So I would like to explore a little bit more with him why otherness is important in his thinking and what kind of otherness would be important today for him. Second question would be probably, well, he was exploring in the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, of his great work, the apophatic way. We know more about God, what God is not, than what God is. And this is what we call in theology, as you know, apophatic way. And he explored a lot of the positive way to talk about God. And the whole Summa is a great cathedral of thinking, as Father Chenou used to talk about the Summa Theologiae. It's a cathedral, a Gothic cathedral. Every element is perfect part of the whole structure. But why, at the end of his life, Aquinas was saying that probably all he wrote about God was like nothing. And he was open to this other aspect of theology, with this apophatic. We need to keep quiet. We need to contemplate God's love. And then we need to act, right? Agency is coming from. But this more mystical experience of theology, I would be interested in listening and asking Aquinas what he thinks about it today. How can we create some kind of theology in the midst of rebels of society today? And how can we confess that God is acting in the world today? And I think this kind of apophatic approach would be very interesting to listen to Aquinas to translate his own theology of apophatic way in these contemporary terms. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, Dr. Mendoza, thank you. I mean, that's a beautiful response. And as much as you might value St. Thomas Aquinas as an interlocutor, I value you as an interlocutor today. And I'm sure our audience will value the opportunity to have a bit of that interlocution with you at the Aquinas Lecture. So I thank you for your time. I thank you for your insights. And I'm so eager to welcome you to our campus January 30th for the Aquinas Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.
Yes. To our audience, don't miss Dr. Carlos Mendoza-Álvarez's 2025 Aquinas Lecture, Otherness and Revelation, Aquinas and the Work of Gustavo Gutiérrez. This lecture will take place January 30th. It's a Thursday. It'll happen at 7 p.m. in the Whitley Event Center here on the campus of Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. Registration is free, and you can register by visiting our Eventbrite page or our website, www.ost.edu. Until next time, thank you again for watching, listening, and especially for being part of the continuing education community here at Oblate School of Theology. Remember, leave nothing undared for the gospel. God bless you.